All right, this is exercise 18-3 on page 1119, and there's actually a lot going on in this problem. We're going to have to do the revenue recognition, divide which parts go to the lease and which parts go to something else. We then have to classify this as either an operating or a capital lease, and then finally we have to do the journal entries based upon which type of lease we end up classifying this as. And I'm going to go ahead and read this problem because it's pretty integral to what's going on here, particularly early in the lease. So we've got Baby Clothing Enterprises leases digital imaging equipment from Sally Systems Leasing. The lease term is for 3 years and the economic life of the equipment is 5 years. The lease contract does not contain a purchase option and title will not be transferred at the end of the lease term. The fair market value of the equipment is $5,500 and there is no guaranteed residual value. Sally Systems does not offer any incentives to the lessee to enter into the lease. BC paid $550 in initial direct costs on the lease equipment date. BC's incremental borrowing rate is 4% and is used to measure the present value because the lessor's implicit rate is not readily determinable. The annual lease payments due January 1st of each year are $990, which includes technological consulting over the lease of the term. Now remember, with a lease, the payment comes up front at the beginning of the year. So we're going to be paying the $550 plus the $990 here. That's an important concept to catch, right? Okay, the digital imaging equipment is typically leased for $900 per year, and the consulting is provided at a price of $450 a year. BC has not made the election to account for each separate lease component along with the non-lease components as a single lease component. As a result, the components must be separated. All right, so the first thing we do is we have to separate these. And the way we do that is we know that the lease is normally for $900 a year. And we know the consulting is normally for $450 a year. So when we add those two together, we get $1,350. And so 900 divided by 1350 is going to be 66.7%, basically 2/3. And 450 divided by 1350 is going to be 33.3% or 1/3. Okay, well, then we multiply each of those percentages times the lease payment, which is $990. That's given to us, right? And so we get $660 a year is going to the lease. $330 a year is going to the consulting. All right, so now we have that divided and we can now go into classifying this as to what type of lease it is. Remember, there are 5 criteria for classifying a lease. Number 1, does title transfer? And the answer here is no. It says specifically title will not be transferred. So no to 1. Number 2, is there a bargain purchase option? And it says here, the lease contract does not contain a purchase option. If there's no purchase option, there can't be a bargain purchase option. So number 2 is no. Number 3, do we have 75% or more of the economic life? Well, we're leasing it for 3 years. The expected life is 5 years. That would be 60%. So we do not meet the 75% threshold, and that's a no. Number 4 is, do we have 90% of the fair market value of the lease payment? So we've got to do a little math here. So we pull out our time value of money tables, and we find for an annuity due, remember the lease payments come up front, so we have to use the annuity due. And so for 4% for 3 years of an annuity due, our factor is 2.8864. on that. And, 069, excuse me, 069. And we're going to multiply that times the lease portion of the payments, which is the 660. And when we do that, we get 1904.80 cents. I'm going to go ahead and round that to 1905 on that. And then, but don't forget that we're paying $550 up front. So we're going to add the $550 to that, and that will be $24.55. Now we're going to use that number later, so we're going to come back to that. So now we sit there and divide 24.55 by 5,500, and we basically get 45%. So we're about half of the threshold of 90%. And so the answer there is no. And number 5 is it a specialized type of equipment such that nobody else can use it? And the answer is no. This is just standard imaging equipment, like a copy machine, scanner, that sort of thing. All right, so this is an operating lease because we met none of the criteria to be a capital lease. Remember, if any one of those 5 had been a yes, this would have been a capital lease. But since all 5 are no, this is an operating lease. All right, so now we have to go on and we have to create our initial entry to get this on the books. And so to get this on the books, we're going to call this a right of use asset. Okay, so that's going to be this number, the 2455, right? We're going to have lease liability. So this is when we enter into the lease, and that will be the 1905. And then we'll have cash that we're paying when we sign the lease of 550, and that balances, and we've got it on the books. Now let me talk just briefly about right of use asset. When you own something, you actually own a bundle of rights. Lawyers talk about a bundle of rights. We should be familiar with that around here, because if you buy a piece of land fee simple, you own everything, right? You own the surface rights, you own the mineral rights, you own any other rights there are that could be had. Water rights are different than mineral rights. And so you own all the rights. We can separate that and we can sell the water rights, we can sell the mineral rights, we can lease those, and then we still own the surface rights. So we are talking about ownership as a bundle of rights. When we're talking about a piece of equipment, you have a number of rights. When you own something, you can use it. You have the right to use it under the whatever is legal to do something. So you can use something. You can modify it. So if you go out and buy a car, you can put a bigger engine in it. You can put a different transmission, different muffler system in it, whatever it might be. You are allowed to modify it. You are allowed to sell it. You're allowed to lease it to anybody else. There's a number of different things you can use. You even have the right to dispose of it, provided it's allowed by law. And so ownership is a bundle of rights. So when you lease something, You probably can't modify it without permission. Now, sometimes when you lease a restaurant, they allow you to redo the kitchen or to redo the decor in the restaurant. And so you have that right. So you do have the right to modify in those circumstances. When you, in this case, you probably don't have the right to sell it. You don't own it, so you can't sell it, but you do have the right to use it. And so that's why we call this a right of use asset. Okay. All right. So now we have to do a amortization table for this. And so what we do now is we take the full lease payment, $660. Remember, this is the lease payment, not the full $990, because the $660 is the only part that goes to the lease, and we multiply that times 3, and that gives us $1,980. And we're going to add the $550 cash we paid up front, and that will give us $24.25. Excuse me, forgot to carry my one. Will give us $25.30 on that. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to divide that over 3 years. This is going to be our lease expense. It won't be all of the lease expense, but it will be the major portion of the lease expense. So we divide that by 3. So $25.30 divided by 3 equals 843.33. We're going to handle that by putting 844 in year 1, 843 in year 1, 843 in year 2, 844 in year 3. So we're dealing with round numbers. All right. Now, we are also going to have to accrue the interest. We don't call it interest, but it is really interest. So let's go over here and make a T account. And this is going to be our lease liability. Now, when we do this up front, our lease liability is the $1,905. Here we are right here. But when we make our first lease payment, it will be for $660. And so we are going to have $1,245 as our lease payment. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take that $1,245 and we're going to multiply it by 4%. Remember, that's our interest rate, and that's $49.80. We're going to round that to 50. So 4%, that'll be 50. And that's going to be accrued at the end of year 1. So we've gotten to use this $1,245 for 1 year, and we're going to accrue $550. We're going to do that again. It'll be half of that, right? And so that will be 25 that we accrue at the end of year 2. And then at the end of year 3, we have nothing to accrue. Now, what we do is we then subtract that, and we get $17.93. I'm sorry. Yeah, $7.93, not $17.93. We get $7.93 for our lease expense in year 1. We get $8.18 for our lease expense in year 2, and then $8.44 for our lease expense for that part in year 5. All right, so I'm going to flip the page now, and we will make our journal entries for the lease payments in year 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so our year 1 journal entry. This is January 1, so 1/1 of year 1 is going to be lease liability. And that's going to be $660, and we're going to pay cash. All right, so far so good. That's pretty easy. Then on 12/31 year 1, we're going to have to accrue our lease expense. And so our lease expense is going to be that full $843 that we calculated, right? And then we're going to have accrued lease payable. And that's going to be the $50 that really is interest, but we're not calling it interest. We're calling it accrued lease payable. And the accumulated amortization is going to be the $793 on that. So that's the end of year 1. At the end of year 2, we now go to 1/1 year 2, and this is where we're going to make our payment, and we're going to have accrued lease payable. And that's going to be $450. So we're just writing off this that we just put on the books the day before. We're going to get that off the books. We're going to have our lease liability. And remember, our lease payment is $660. So $660 minus $50 is $610 there. And then our cash that we are paying is the $660. All right, so now at the end of year 2, we're going to do this again. We're going to have the lease expense. And once again, it's going to be the $843. We're going to have accrued lease payable. And that is for the 25. And then we're going to have the accumulated amortization. And that will be the 818, all right? All right, the end of year 2. Beginning of year 3. On that one, we will have the accrued lease payable. And that this time is $25. We're going to have the lease liability. Remember, we're paying $660. So $660 minus 25 is $635. And that's going to be the lease liability. And then we're paying cash for $660. Okay. And so that takes care of our lease expense. The consulting, on the other hand, is the same every year. At the beginning of the year, 1/1, we will have prepaid consulting for $330 and cash $330. And then on 12/31, we will have consulting expense, and that will be $330, and prepaid consulting $330, and that will be the same amount each and every year for the 3 years. All right, so that concludes exercise 18-3. Feel free to view this again. There's a lot going on in this particular problem, and we will see you on the next exercise.